Okay.
Yes, because I know later I will ask you.
Perfect. Thank you.
I just have one question. Has anything
What?
new
Should be.
like MacBook charger that Liz can borrow for a second? Like do you have one? Just because
So, like one example here, let's say you visit Mass or my Facebook profile, and then your browser says to the server, hey, I want Rasmus or Mass Facebook profile. Then the server has a Java object, creates a JSON, sends it to your browser. Your browser takes this JSON, unravels it, and then creates like a JavaScript object out of it, and then it can display it in your browser.
It's like simulation.
Pardon?
It's like simulation between JavaScript.
I wouldn't call it a simulation, no.
Sorry, but I think I mean we can see it here. So it's like a simulation between JavaScript file and it's like that or not.
It's taking something from the server, putting it into like a format called JSON. You could call it serialization, maybe, but that's also not 100%. It sends it to your browser, and then your browser takes it, puts it into an object like you know it, and then you can display it. You will see that.
Try to do it the other way around. I'll create a JSON object. JSON is always strings. When it comes in, it's just a string that looks like a JavaScript object, but it's a string. So we use the string syntax. I can't do that. I can do this stuff. Have you used these string literals? We'll do it just for the readability. So we can have name. The difference is that in JSON, the keys will always have double quotes. You cannot write it the same way that I write it down here. So we will have a name, and we will have the age. And you see also in my JavaScript notation, I can use what's called a trailing comma. That will also not be valid here, because it has to be very strict in the way we pass it. But if we have this is a string that just contains this format. So if we run this through a JSON parse, and then JSON-T, it should convert it to a JavaScript object. Let's try it. It's object. Let's use a const just to. Let's try to run this. Go in the console, dump it in. Didn't copy it. See, so it takes this string that looks like a JavaScript object, and when I run it through this JSON parse function, it converts it into a JavaScript object. So you can also see the styling is a little different. It removes these double quotes. It doesn't add the trailing comma, but that's fine. But it looks, this one looks like when I wrote the same JSON string in plain JavaScript. Okay. So JSON is a way to compress data into a way you can send it, like we just heard the example with Facebook. If you want to use Facebook's API to fetch your own profile, you would call the API. We will see how you do that later. And you will get your data back in a JSON format. So it's like a structured format where you can see your profile data on Facebook, and then you can use it for whatever purpose you want to use it. Yes?
Is just about the format and the syntax difference in the syntax?
Yes. Well, JSON is a data format for transferring data between multiple APIs or people. Say that. Back in if you're going back 10, 12 years ago, we all used, you could still transfer data between things, but we use XML instead. And XML is fairly similar to HTML. It's very bloated, it's very big, and you can do a lot of things with it. And at some point, people found out that we're building these JavaScript applications, and we need a more efficient way to transfer data. So they use this JSON object notation because it's so simple, it's very, very compact, and it's very lightweight to send. There's not a lot of extra data you send. So when you send the data, you basically only send the keys, and then you send the actual data that you want to send.
One more example, like after the line 14.
Yeah.
After 14.
What do you want to log?
Console log, object.name.
This one?
Another console launch.
Oh, you want to do it? Okay, yeah. Yeah.
So you see line 15 and 16? What do you think line 15 will do? And what do you think line, if you go back, just let them guess first. So do you see line 15 and 16? What do you think line, no, don't scream it out. Think for yourself. What do you think line 15 will do? And what do you think line 16 will do? Will they do exactly the same?
The same.
Will one of them cause an error? Yes. Who understands why one of them will cause an error? Does everyone know? Does one of them causes an error?
Yeah, 16.
Why will 16 cause an error?
Because is
Everyone understands that?
JSON key is a string, so it's not not a key.
So you see that this is a string,
So it's not an object. Yeah.
and this is a string,
Yeah.
and string doesn't have the property name. After we call this one, and this function here, this JSON function, takes this, understands this, and creates this object that we did manually down here.
Yeah.
So now this one actually has the name. Does that make sense? And this one, we can send it between servers and clients. And this one, we can't. So you see, every time we want to send something between servers, we will convert it to this, send it, and then get it back.
Won't be accessing JSON object. Everything happens separate files.
Exactly.
That's why they have.
Pardon? That's why what?
The others tell us to manipulate.
Can you repeat your question?
No, we don't know.
It's a good question.
Because when I was reading API, I couldn't understand what's the difference with the user interface.
Okay.
And the,
We'll come to API later.
Okay. Exactly. I think it's that was my question.
It's like I translated for just communicating. Like in a very stupid simple way.
Yeah, but it's also human. It's also human readable.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so like readable and that's the point, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if we would make it machine readable and not human readable, we could do that. We could make it way more efficient if we would only make it machine readable. We would just make ones and zeros. Yeah. So this is it's true what you're saying, but it's also human readable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun is having structured, very structured. And it's easy for everyone to. And you'll see this, every API you will use will most likely use this. Not everyone, but pretty much. It's hard to find an API these days that don't support JSON. Let's try to go the other way. So this way here we have a simple JSON string, parse it into a JSON object. We had a little test here. I'm just going to remove. Should we try to run this just for fun? Here it is. So the first. That's fine. So you have masked the first one, logged out my name, as you said. The second one undefined, because it's a string and you try to use the key name on a string, that doesn't work. Okay, so let's try to go the other way. So we have now a JavaScript object, and we want to convert that back into a JSON object. So we used JSON parse before to convert to JSON to a JavaScript object. When you want to go the other way, object can use JSON serialized. Try to see what it does. This one. Look at that. Let's try to run it. Sorry? JSON. Let's just see what it does. I'll show you. JSON does parse, then it will. There you go. Did I not spell it correctly? Let's use vars for these. Ah, yes. Because we just talked about serializing. There we go. JSON stringify. Try it. You see it converts the JavaScript object to a JSON object. So it converts it back again. So now we can go back and forth.
Maybe we can do I call your JSON string, and then you know what I mean? You can
Yes, go back and forth.
at the moment we have like a JS object, and then on the JSON object we have a lot of weird variable names. So this one is like JS. It's object, like I would do it JSON exactly.
It's going to rename some variables.
This one is JSON object to JSON, right?
Oh yeah, this is good. Better?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's one.
It's going to rename some variables. There we go. I'm going to do this as far as.
Maybe that confused them.
Yeah, I think so. That's all right. Okay. From JSON to JavaScript, we use JSON parse. It will convert the JSON object to a JavaScript object. If we want to go the other way, we use JSON stringify. Give it a JavaScript object, and it will convert it to a JSON object. That's pretty much what there is in transferring JSON to JavaScript and back again. That's all we do. These two requests. JSON stringify has a bit more extra options you can use, but you will likely never need them. It has a formatter. You'll be able to choose your own way where it will make it into JSON. I never used it. I did this 20 years or so. It has this second object here, which is fairly useful. I'll show you what it does, just so you have seen it. It will, if you use the second object that says to, for instance, when you parse it into a JSON object, I don't want to stingify it. And
If I make that error, it will be like 2 hours.
Yeah.
What I did wrong.
you see you didn't see the difference. Let's go do the other one again. So when I use it directly, JSON stringify, it will write it in a machine-readable format. If I use the other variant, it will write it in a human-readable format with indentation 2, because I wrote 2. So this is useful if you want to, for some reason, write your JSON out so you can actually read what's happening, instead of having a big blob of code.
But this one is still a string.
It's still a string. Not try to confuse more than needed. Okay, let's try to play a little bit more with this object. JSON supports string, as we've seen, integers. It supports the null value. Null value could be, maybe I don't want to type in my address, so I'll set it as null. It supports Boolean value, is male, true. And it supports, the last one, remember? Sorry? Arrays and objects.
Phone number and data type.
Array, yes. So let's call it interests maybe. I have teaching, coding. And one more? Objects. So let's have an object.
We'll make a total lesson.
Yes. It will be very empty. Let's just say JS1 true. Directions here. JS2 false. JS3 true. And I like the training commas. All right, let's try to output this thing. So this should still work, right? If we have these, we only use the variables that we actually support, or the data types that we actually support for JSON. So when we output this, it will still work. And you kind of see what I meant before. If you do that null too, you can actually read what it does. If you write it like this, the more data you have, it will just turn into a big blob.
Yeah. Can you do the null too real quick?
Yeah.
And also drag this one up so that we have the null.
Oh.
So a very common mistake that happens, if you look at the JSON, not the JSON, the JavaScript object over here, you scroll over, you can see that the last element of each object here has a comma, and also this object in an object, this full lesson, is the object inside of this object, has also a comma here. And if you go down here, that's not the case. So when you have to, right now we're going from object to JSON. But if you go from JSON to object, then you have to type this one yourself. Okay? And if you type this one yourself, and you put this comma, you will get an error. Right?
Yes.
And this could also be a mistake that you will search for a long, long time, but it's just a comma here. Yeah. Just be aware, if something like this goes wrong, there could be this comma at the end. And then...
Yes. Let's just try one more example. I'll show you a linter afterwards. So if we use a key that is not defined, let me just, oh, sorry. Working in console. Let's just do it. If we add one more that says, I don't know, something, and we add a function to it. Function should not be supported in JSON. What will happen to it if we try to stringify this? Anyone know? Anyone has a guess?
It will just convert it to a string or error.
Empty string or error? Let's see. Can you see it? Let's just do null 2 again. It was here, right?
Yeah.
So it just disappears. So JSON is very forgiving in this thing, but it can also cause weird errors for you. If you expect something, Peter, if you put maybe not a function, but you could use a key that says something undefined. And you can use undefined as a value, which is valid in JavaScript. It will also remove it, which is the same as undefined.
Why do you think a function shouldn't be part of the JSON? Yes, that's a good idea. Yeah. So it's not data, right? And if you look at this example over here with the MapReduce filter, our data is like what's in the arrays, and the function is the transformation. And when we want to send data from A to B, we don't want to send the transformations. We just want to be able to send the data.
Okay. So we have one more tool that you can use if you want to validate. Sorry. Go ahead.
But a function will return the data, right?
Pardon?
A function will return the data.
Yes,
So
yes.
That's a data, right?
Yeah, but a function can also exist without the data. Right?
Okay.
It's there.
And if you were able to put a function inside a JSON, then if you make an API and I use it, I don't want to call whatever function you put in. I want to have my own function. So JSON is only for sharing data between, not code. There are other ways to share code if you wanted to, but it's not so much in JavaScript.
What if you have what if you have an API? You get data from this API, and a function would be in this data. And then a hacker comes and does something to the API.
Yeah.
And you just download and execute the function that the hacker has changed on your machine.
So to be kind of static, what we do and it will do.
Exactly.
Yes, it's just data.
Yes.
Also, I think the function it will not run because it will the data when it's running when we call it it will never run the data. It will be called exactly that because I think it will not run.
All right, we will just introduce the last tool, and then we'll do a little exercise with JSON. You can see what it says. It says jasonlint.com. I will put it in the code. jasonlint.com. So when you copy your JSON, this is a linter. Linter means that it will check the syntax. Linters exist in various different forms in coding, but this one, JSLint. Copy my JSON object in here. My JSON object, and I click this validate JSON. And it will say valid JSON. That's good. So let's try the trailing comma error that we just talked about before. So if I try to validate this, it will give an error.
Can you put a function on it?
It wouldn't make sense because can JSON have functions? Try it. See what happens.
So I do. Yeah.
It will likely give an error. It should at least if it works. Expecting string, number, null, true, false, object, or error. So a tool like this can help you if you need to write valid JSON by hand. A tool like this. In the real world, you rarely write JSON with hand. You usually have a JavaScript object and you convert it, or you get it from an API and you convert it. Never, I wouldn't say never, but you rarely write it in hand. But for this purpose of this exercise, we will. So, this leads to the first exercise. This one here.
Link is online.
We will we will share the whole code, or you want it now? The code?
I think we'll share it after, right?
Yeah, we will share it.
So it doesn't get too easy. So this meal ordering website. Do you have to, should I just open my Slack? Post this? Do you all have to link to the homework, or should I just leave it? Imagine you're running a meal ordering website, so orders come in from the web and we need to store them in a JSON file. Create a JSON file with 2 orders that contain at least 3 of these. So write a valid JSON, a .json file, write valid JSON inside it, and it will have the data for these 5, well, at least 3, but up to 5 bullet points. Okay? Let me know if you have questions. I think we will continue until around 1, unless everyone gets done before.
20 minutes.
Too long? Yeah.
No, it's fine. We will also see when everyone is
Yeah.
finished.
And then maybe a 10-minute break afterwards.
First read it, 2 minutes, and then ask questions. Yes, yes. I think there is a. That happened to me yesterday.
Okay, you know what you need to do? Just go to Week1. Just don't access through the link page. Just click Week1 because the link is broken, and then you can access it.
Should I post it in Slack?
Pardon? You posted it back?
No.
I think this one is the link. Now then. It's the link.
You just have to click on channels to join the channel.
There you go.
JSON files is always three strings, even numbers.
No, numbers is the value.
Maybe the first thing to think about just in your head is order name, what data type, order ID, what data type, price, what data type, list of drinks, what data type in what kind of data type. Get a mental model, right? Mental model.
But considering that you show the string type on part, should I just write it as I normally do in JavaScript and then use the function?
No, I think you should create a JSON file. So you should create a string that we will then pass.
You have to have two orders. So if you go to an array objects, write up objects, different objects.
No, you can basically make an object. Make an object. And make like, for instance, orders. And then inside of orders an array of two objects which each are ordered. But there's you have all possibilities, right? But they should all be in one JSON. Yeah. Like the two orders have to be in one JSON. Can a JSON immediately start with an array? What has to be not?
I think you can start with an array, right? Yeah, you can.
I'm not sure.
I'll definitely get data back from APIs.
Like often when I get something back, it's like an object with a data field, and then in
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's fine.
I think you can, you can probably just start your JSON like an array.
Yeah, that's fine.
always work the same, right?
Sorry?
Just wanted to protect.
Yeah,
It's okay? Because it will already.
Does everyone know what to do?
For comments, we're saying that.
Remember, you have to write a string.
No, the
You have to write a string. Not,
Not probably.
not, okay. Yes.
Why?
Yes, but you can also start with the main string. You can start it with.
Danish keyboard all over again. No, but I just using this regularly.
Try to out.
But I mean, I can.
If the numbers has to have provisions. You have to not technically a string.
No, but I can run with the. It's okay. But before I was using it without using the script, so maybe the problem in the configuration. Like that?
At the moment, I think it has to do with
Or it's in the.
it doesn't.
No.
Yes.
No, it's not. Now it is.
You start the string again. Are you coming out of this one there?
Yeah, but it's not really.
Here. The shop person.
It doesn't
It doesn't
run.
Because this is a JSON.
Yes, because I use it to take control.
Yeah. And also like this.
Now it's still the same. That's a long string.
Because it's the same
Is it full now?
Yeah, but the first one is still the market. But can I have like a short? Okay, just.
Has an array, has got. It's just a long string, and the long string describes a JSON structure. Okay, and then we can use the JavaScript functionality to take this JSON structure into a JavaScript. It's just a string, it's like this string, if you find string. So I did like trying to now, use path function, like JSON path. Go to and include like JSON, come down to JSON path.
I think the code is actually.
Okay. And read Okay. If you want to have a little bit of like help, like let's go in here. Const. So I had 2 questions so far, if I can get everyone's attention. So we want a long string. So you have to write a string, and then in there, like a long JSON. Yeah. So your variable that you're writing, if it's in a JS file, has to be within these things. Because we're writing a JSON, which is a long string, but the content of this long string defines the JSON. And then what you can do is you can, since we have to do 2 orders, right? We have to do 2 orders. You can do like this. Where in here is the first order, and in here is the second order. So your JSON can start as a yeah. Because I've also seen something like this, which makes sense, is probably correct, but not what we 100% want, is to start this like an object and then do like, you see that? This would also work. Oof, what happened? Jesus. Right. So this would also work, but every time in homeworks or something, like I see an object where it says order 1, order 2, order 3, order 4, I'm saying like that's an array, right? The moment you create definitions, properties, which count from 1 to something, that should be an array. Yeah. Right? So this, and then put yours in here.
It's only for
That's just for you to find out. You can easily test it, right? Don't ask questions, you can test yourself. And there's a little mistake here. Good. Ah! Again?
You should normally never use var. Constant let is the one to use. The reason I use var here is because when I copy it into the console, if I copy it multiple times, it will give an error if you give constant. It's already when you reload the browser here. That's why I do it. You should always use constant or let. Yeah, it's This is in a JavaScript file. See, that's const like a string holes. For the assignment, it would be beneficial if it was about JSON file. Now if you have a .json file, you can't have JavaScript. No, just try to remove.
Because it must.
Yeah. Like validate JSLint, JSLint. Just Google JSLint. Lint, LINT. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So can I like throw in for everyone what has been explained over here? It's like if we define this JSON inside of JavaScript, we have to create a string, and this string goes into like our variable. You see that? And if this was if this file was like only a JSON file, we wouldn't have comments, we wouldn't have code, we would just start immediately like this. Okay? Yeah. You understand that? Yeah. So like if this was just .json, we wouldn't have everything on top here. We would just have this and like all the JSON on it. Oh. So the JSON doesn't contain any JavaScript. So what is the JSON here? It's only this. And everything around that is JavaScript. So if we do like a JSON file, just like.
But, so if I make a JSON file, all what I need to do is open the array from the code and create the object. That's it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
And the
Put it in a JSON file, you would call it with the SMP.
Now the problem is I have made minus JSON and I have JavaScript. If I make this JavaScript, I have to make it in the brackets. I removed it, this is going to be abandoned. This is not right.
There was some things which we can use, right? Yeah, but I'm saying.
So we have to do this because I divided by.
Why is it do that?
Just have a simple. Whenever you have just a JS file that's like this, my
They say we couldn't have spaces, right?
I wonder where.
So I just need to put it together. This?
Yeah, exactly. So it will never be, it's not really this way.
And there's color a square or
Shall I create a something like a name? Or do you want? Am I too intrusive? No.
But now it's just
Jason.
There's over. I can go.
I can just have one dash under the key, but yes, I can have still. How many do I have?
So they're just going to go instead of the process. And then it's different. Exactly. But yeah, I'm going to keep it just because of the way. You know that. Okay. Did you also get
Yes, actually, as an entrance, exactly, so that they
Actually, that's what I want to do. That's the
okay, I correct the ocean. Unexpected events, it's all about mistakes. Okay, that's all then.
Das schon hatte gesagt, Jason ist noch drauf. Another area around you have two items.
Does everyone have something like this now? Okay. Here. Are you using columns and not equal signs? The commas are all correct? All the keys are in this? I also have a mistake in here, right? You can look for it, but pardon? Pardon? Don't scream out the error.
I'm pretty sure I didn't.
Exactly, that's, yeah. I'm just removing all the and also here, right? Here it's also
Thank you so much. We actually was non-stop, like. In my section.
And link. The second
Remember that it's open just the first week. From 1 to 5. From the 1st of January to the. I think I go on. Yeah, it's going to be 1st of January and then I can show you my plan base, so then choose when. That's why I like to make this wait because they need stuff for which one?
Yes, that's a mistake.
So you just spent 800 kroner a year.
But like often when the computer tells you
And you just got a brand new one. It's a from the yeah.
So is it something that is
you scroll up and like
game of
shall we do a break?
Yeah, we have. We start in about 5 minutes.
Yes, 5 minutes break.
Okay. So it's like when I'm
It's always amazing when you start with a versatile exercise and problems.
the program will take it from JavaScript base and send it, for example, to the user and convert it again.
Did it change form in JavaScript?
Your backpack. I just put my hands to do something else. No, my backpack. And then I was like, what is this piece that I'm touching in my backpack? Sorry,
I'm trying to put it in the link.
It's like copyright.
Quotation mark, quotation mark, maybe it's always not. You take a look at other hormones. In for them, like country, take a look about other hormones, how they do it. Something like this. Yeah, that's why we showed you the link.
वो किया था वो वाला मैप वाला मैप वाला इसमें करंट लोकेशन दिखा उसमें उसकी की जनरेट की थी फिर कैसे किया करंट लोकेशन वाला विदाउट की जनरेट क्योंकि वो एक पार्ट के बाद ना वो पेड उसके ऊपर लेके जाते हैं पेमेंट करनी पड़ेगी बिकॉज हम उसकी की यूज करेंगे हमारे लिए यूनिक भी होना करंट लोकेशन जो मैप के ऊपर गूगल मैप्स भी हाँ वो तो थोड़ा डिफिकल्ट है मुझे लगा तो मैं पार किया तो वेकेशन पे अच्छा हम ऐसा कर सकते हैं क्या मतलब मुझे लगता है कि सारा करना मैंडेटरी होता है मुझे नहीं पता था कि छोड़ सकते हैं हाँ ऑप्शनल नहीं करना है मैंने चाहिए तो नहीं करना पर वो ऑप्शनल आ गया
Not a mistake here. This one. Maybe some more stuff. Hang on. I put some mistakes in there.
Yeah.
I also just looked into here, and I was like, oh shit, can't save it as a JSON file. The Sublime will lint it.
Yeah. You can also do this one.
Oh really?
Yeah, one of the ones I never even seen that one because you never write like.
Yeah, exactly. Let's put that one in there. It's a nasty one. And maybe this one as well. This is also not consistent. What do you use then? React? Are you in the front end?
Only way. I used to do it on the as well. Yes.
Yeah. 1 minute. Quick. If you have to go to the toilet, go. A water.
Takes more time.
Oh yeah. Always. I love the. I did one-step command line, and I showed them like CD, and then half of the class CD, and directly the didn't go to space. And you're like now it's always CD space LS space. I just made it common to like pronounce it, but. I think like what I usually try to do is like give them like the why, and then they can read up the how themselves. But I mean, it would be. Can't we upload this one to like a server and like just have it live somewhere? Yeah, we can call it, but like if we put it on Pastebin or something like that, we can say like the Pastebin.
I have some other APIs I already planned out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, that's fine.
We could try to call it just locally, just to see how we get into it.
I'm curious how many mistakes I have. Do I also have to like the column? To be like this or like this?
Look like this. Like JavaScript doesn't matter.
I was dying. Jesus Christ.
So like a special kind from the culture.
Yeah, I think it's kind of tea, like tea.
Yeah, I'm more interested about the cup. Is it wooden?
Yeah, it's wood, but it's, but you can't drink it in normal coffee. Traditionally, they use
I guess it's so many times.
So next question.
I'm gonna show you this and like ask there are like several mistakes in there. And I will ask you to find the mistakes. So yeah, but I want to do it together. Oh yeah. But good job.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure.
Are you a student? You just coming to watch? Otherwise, you can also like sit inside. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. It's my mistake. Okay. It's my first time here as well. Yes. So is everyone back? We're missing one. Oh, she's here. She's here. So here I got like a JSON for you, and I put in some mistakes. So could we now raise our hands and like tell me whether mistakes? I have some mistakes where JSON is going to say that's a mistake in JSON, but I also have some mistakes. They are syntactical. So JSON will read them, but they don't make 100% sense. Okay? Okay. Over there.
I can say the big size in single quotes, just with double quotes.
Yeah. So we have here the single quote here as well, and I'll do them to double quotes. Here we go. Like next one, next arm. Here, what do you want to? Arms, not mouth.
the ID 1.
Yes.
You have a string, it would work, maybe?
Yes, it would work.
It's not what you want.
Exactly. So this should be a number, right? Everyone agrees?
Unless you want it to be a string.
Yes.
For some reason, right?
Yeah, but
Because it would work.
yeah. A credit card number could be a string, for instance. Maybe.
Should it be or shouldn't it?
I wouldn't, but like sometimes it maybe would. Yeah.
Because it should be read as a
Yeah.
number, right?
Yeah, but like if you then put it as an integer into like a, and then it becomes too long, and then the integer. So like in a computer, a number is often saved as like a number, right? But like then you have say it's an integer, and the integer goes from minus 14 million to plus 14 million, and the credit card number could be a higher number than 14 million. You understand that? And then you save it in the database and it then converts it somewhere in between that space. So suddenly your credit card number is not like something countable. Yeah. So then if you look at it mathematically, then you can say a credit card number, my credit card number and his credit card number. I can't say something like my credit card number is bigger than his. That wouldn't make sense, right? So now they are not numbers. But if I have different IDs, I could say this ID is bigger than that one, right? Sort of. Yeah. But does it make sense?
Yeah.
So from a mathematical perspective. So next problem in here. Tanya?
You have the comma in extras mushroom garlic. The last comma is going to be down.
This one here
Yeah.
should go away.
But also mistaken. So what you noticed when I make quite a few times after Coca-Cola, you first have to put a semicolon and then first comma.
Okay, anyone wants to raise their hand and give me But like, what were you going to say? Yes? Yeah.
Okay, if it drinks, then you have Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
And it's called reverse commas, then inverted commas of Coca-Cola, and then semicolon. And the semicolon should go before. Oh no. No, sorry, no.
There's a mistake there in line 4, definitely. But what is the mistake?
Should be comma.
It should be comma, but then there's still a mistake. There's still a mistake.
They also
Array. Everyone's screaming array. So this should be an array. Did you see that? So I made a weird kind of object out of it. Any more mistakes?
In line 10, we have just one string point to be put in the array. In one run, one.
Well, like, I would rather ask the other question. Why is 11 not an array
At 11.
in line 11?
Because it's only in one, right?
So if you write a for loop, okay, and that for loops, in the first loop, it takes pizza, in the second loop, it takes falafel. Then, inside this for loop is another for loop. In the first for loop, it takes pizza, and then it goes through the drinks.
Yeah.
And then in the second iteration of the first for loop, it gets falafel, and gets faxi condi in its for loop. So, do you get that, like, we have to be consistent in both of our...
perfecto. Yeah. That makes sense.
have to be consistent because if this is swallowed in a program, and we have two for loops, and this one is not an array, like then we have to write two different programs to analyze it. Yes. So that's why I would think this should be an array. Yes. Does that make sense? And also this guy should be an array, because this one is an array. Does that make sense? So the JSON was clear, but like if it then goes to a program, the program wants to do the same thing on both of them. So the syntax should be the same. Okay? Everyone understood that?
There's any extra space at the end of the thing
Oh, that's a good question, yeah.
because I made that mistake.
Let's try to
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
let's just try the linter.
Would that be a problem?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. All the thing was yellow.
Oh, it ain't it.
Okay. I'll put it in there manually.
No, I think it ain't it. Yeah, the editor. Yeah. The linter eats it, so it won't show up in the linter, but you definitely had it in your IDE. So do you see the extra white space? Sneaky problems.
Yes?
Can you make the keys to have more than just one word? For example, list of drinks. So it
Yeah.
shows how to write it.
Typically, when you write keys, you would write them. There's multiple ways of doing it because you can't have white spaces, right? That's the one you also got. So if you write it like this, you will get an error. So there are typical ways of doing it is using these lower bracket, so it underscores. But the more, it depends on preference. My preference is camel case, like this. So I don't have to do the underscores, but both will work. As long as it's one string and there's no white space in it, both will work. So this one would be fine.
And what happens if I mix them? I have one key like space and one key without the
The JSON will be fine if you mix them, but as a like code readability and all that stuff, it's good to have just one, choose one way to do it. And I will say camel case is the most common way to do it. Some APIs can return data in any kind of weird naming, but in code you write, I would advise to use camel case always, basically, almost always.
So if you just click on this tab here, you see that? So here I save this JSON s.json, and the supply text already gives me a really red filter inside of the editor. So we save this one s.json.
I'll just fix it.
And then you can see here, down here it says it recognizes the JSON file. And now it gave me already some mistakes, just like a little linter. Like just like your VS code sometimes gives you JavaScript code these red. So that can happen. But there's still these mistakes. Exactly.
Oh, I didn't copy them, just copy it over. There we go. Okay, so Jason, let's move on then.
So in this JSON file, can I just how I convert this?
Coming now.
That's what we're going to talk about right now. So let's move on to the next bit. So we're going to be talking about APIs. Does anyone know what an API stands for? What API stands for? Application programming. Programming or just programming? Interface. Yeah. So what does that mean? So you have in the things you were supposed to read today, if you read them, I'm not sure, it doesn't matter. The example it gives you is a faucet, electricity outlet. Right? So you take your appliance, you put it into the outlet, and you get power, and it works. And it just plug and play. So that's the example the text gives for an API. But APIs can be basically everything. It can just be when you want to retrieve data from Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, or whatever else you use in your application, you want to have some data from them. So they provide an API that you can integrate into your code, and you can pull data out. A common thing it's also used for is for newsletters. If you go to a website, you sign up to a newsletter, it will most likely be MailChimp, which is the most popular one. So they sell a service for newsletters, and you write a little API integration, and you integrate into their service. So you don't have to implement a whole newsletter system yourself. You just hook into their API. That's like very high level what an API is. Basically, it's just a way where you can connect from your website, in this case, to an external service and get data or save data. So to say. It's basically what you can do. So you can send a request that user will never see, and you can fetch some data for them in whatever way you want to do it. Can you go ahead?
Yeah, I think so. Like from the example earlier with Facebook. So let's say Facebook has an API, and you're chatting with your friend. Then your browser is communicating with Facebook's API. And then you type a message, and then you send that message. Then your browser takes your message, takes your user ID, takes your communicating ID, takes the date, probably. All of this, wraps it into like a little JSON object, sends it to the API. The API like takes it back to a JSON, saves it somewhere, hopefully encrypted, puts it back, sends it to your friend. Your friend gets the JSON with your text and your date when you've written it from you, unwraps it again. You see how this communication then goes like forth and back, like JSON here, up, unwrap it, server, back. And this is all communicating. And you have to learn that because when you learn the backend node, you will write tiny APIs and you will get data from those APIs. And then your browser will display it. So all your computer is just doing is moving strings, numbers, arrays, and objects around. And if you think of it, a news page site is just news articles. That's an array. Every news article is an object. It has a header with a string inside, a date with a date inside, a number with its ID inside. It's text with a string inside. So all of these internet pages, they are just abstractions, like that you can look at them, but everything is just these things, objects, arrays, strings, and they are sent to each other through JSON. Does that make sense? So.
Let's try a small example. Sorry, go ahead.
Pardon?
An API, it receives
It would receive a JSON from you, and you would receive a JSON from it. We will see that in a bit. Now we're just talking about getting a JSON from an API.
Encryption or JSON does that.
Yes.
For securing data.
Yeah. At the moment, we will just get a JSON file and display it.
And if we don't include JSON, we just work with JS, it will not be secure.
No. The security part of passing JSON from the client, from the browser to the server, is typically done through HTTPS, like SSL certificates. So you will have a certificate on your server that will ensure that it gets encrypted, the communication between. So you don't have to do anything.
It's nothing you should know.
I'm just making a case that in mind why we need JS, JSON. When we can JS and
Because you can't when you have a JavaScript object, not a JSON. When you have a JavaScript object, that JavaScript object has been read by a JavaScript compiler, right? It has been read by JavaScript to understand this is an object, right? But now you want to send that object. You can't send the understanding of the compiler, right? You can't send what the compiler has understood, right? Or the interpreter, yeah? So what you do is you create a string which contains, with very specific rules, exactly how your data looks. And this string you can easily send, right? This string you can send. And then you just have to load it and dump it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yes.
Let's try to fetch. We created this file before called test.json. This one we just talked about. So we can try to fetch that locally. So JavaScript has a built-in function called fetch. It's a function. It basically takes two parameters. We're just going to cover one right now. It takes the URL you want to fetch to the URL of the API. Right now we're just going to use this. We have a different example in a bit. So now I'm just going to type test.json, which is the file we just created before. You can see it's in the same, very small, but it's in the same folder as this one, so I can write it like this. And then we do, once it returns the data.
The name of JSON file?
Yes.
The name you gave your JSON file. We're going to use a URL afterwards. I just want to show the example. And then we type then. And we're going to go into this a little more when we talk about promises in like 2 lessons, I think, 1 or 2 lessons. So then we'll have, the first thing it will respond is the response. I'll show you what this means in a bit. We'll say we want the response. We know the response is JSON, so we want it as JSON code. I'm going to go over this. I'm just going to show you for the first. And then we have the data, and we can log that out. Let's try to run this little bit of code here. Forget the mouse. Doesn't work. Failed to fetch. Save it here. Ah, of course. Okay. All right. So we're not going to fetch our own. Apparently, fetch does only work if it's actually on a website. So we need to put it somewhere. Luckily, I have other APIs.
Put it in GitHub? No.
Probably. I don't think I have access. I don't have the right access. But I have a different example. I have some APIs here. So the way an API works normally, when you use an API, we're just going to come back to fetch. This is an API that says deck of cards. This API will be able to give you a deck of cards when you call this method. You always read the documentation. It has an endpoint, which is this. You can't see. There you go. So you will call this endpoint and you will get a deck of cards. You can see the example. It will respond here. A JSON response. Success true. Deck ID. Shuffle true. Remaining 52. How many cards are left in the deck? This is an API that some person built and made available for everyone to use. So everyone who needs to use this can call this method here. Let's just give it a shot with fetch. So we're going to try same thing. I just put in that API instead. Back here. Call it. See, two things happen. It says promise pending. We'll go over this when we talk about promises. It's a big topic, so we'll not do that today. And then you get the response. And you can see the response is the same as what was in the documentation. Right? It's remaining cards, 52, shuffle true, success true, and the ID of the deck. But this is a simple way to call an API. You use fetch, then basically you will almost always use this line here, which means it converts the response to a JSON object. You can try to see what it actually looks like. You want to see it? Try that. So this is the response that it returns. When you call that endpoint, it returns this data. And it will always return something like this. You see it cores, it means it's cross-domain. Has the URL I used, it didn't redirect me. Status might be important. Maybe you want to check when you call it. If it's a status 200, it means everything is fine. It says OK true, and then there's some body in here that you can't really readable stream. And this is why we call this method that's built into the result. Let's call it response so you can actually see what it means. There we go. Into the response, and you can call this JSON method. So it will take the JSON part of the response and just give you that, because you most likely will not use the headers and the status and all that stuff. So this is a fairly common way to write it. Let's go back here, like this. So now we have this data. What if I want to have it out here? I want to save it in this variable. Can I do that? Did you talk about asynchronous communication callbacks? Yeah. So anyone has an idea of how I can get my data into this variable, or how I can use it for something? You can just do this, of course. So if I want to have this is an asynchronous request, right? If I want to use my data down here, let's just make a bigger example. So I want to use my data here, and I want to let's see what it had. Was it an error? Can I return from in here? Will this work?
Give
it a try. Let's do it here. Data. Call this one. data. Try it. So return data gave a promise, and data gave, it was this one in here, right? So this one down here didn't give me the data back. I only got it back in here. But I want to have this, let's say I want to have the deck ID. I want to have the remaining ID. I want to log it out somewhere. Remaining cards. Remaining. Will this work?
It will ask you what you want to show us.
Okay. Let's try to have, okay.
Let's think about like when we start the program from the top, what happens? If you put in these two lines again, what happens? Like our program runs like dum, 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 and he hits this line.
Just do it here. Sorry.
So it hits this line, and then it says we have a variable return data. So we're creating like a little box, return data, label on it, and we want to put like something in there, like it's a variable, and our variable is a box, and we put something in there. And then we call fetch. It's a function from within JavaScript, and what it basically says is fetch. What does fetch mean in English? You take something, right, from somewhere. So it fetches from the internet this one, which is just an API, which you can use to build a program to make a card game. And it will handle for you how many cards are left in the deck and stuff like that. So you can call it again and take a card, and then the deck only has 51 left. Then you take another card, and the deck only has 50 left. And it does everything for you, how many cards they are, which colors they have, and it does it for you. So you just have to write a program that communicates, but the cards is handled for you. So that's what the API does. So now we're just saying, give us a deck. And that's the only thing we want to do. So we ask for a deck. Then we do this line, and this line takes the HTTP protocol to a JSON. So it does a lot of stuff for you that you don't have to understand yet, and it gives you a JSON back. And then this line calls a function which you can put out the data. And that's what we're doing. But now, we actually want the data to be outside here. So we can use it. And last week, you've learned callbacks. So we're going to do it with callbacks, right?
Yes.
Yes. So we're just showing you here, if you put a return in here, this function here, inside of this then, will return this data, but this data is not written to this one. Make sense? So we have a return here, but this return does not write it onto here. Doesn't work. If you run this, so you see here what happens. It goes through here, and then it does fetch. And fetch happens asynchronously. Is that correct?
Well, fetch will give a promise, which is this. Yes. And then it will wait. Then the code will continue to execute down. But then once the API returns, then it will call this one and this one. But this will happen much later. It will already, the code will already have passed all this stuff. And then asynchronously, the promise will give the result back once it comes back from the server. It can be 100 milliseconds, it could be 5 seconds, it could be an hour in theory. It never will.
So you understand that? So this happens, and this returns a promise in here. So here's a promise. And now there's somewhere in your program communicating to your server. But your program doesn't wait. Your program goes on. And then the console log, and it returns this promise here. You see that? This promise. You don't have to understand what the promise is. You just have to see what is the sequence, what is happening. This happens, then this, And then the last thing that happens is this data is returned. So where's this data logged out? It's in this line, right? So what's happening? How is it executed? This is executed, but what inside of this then is not processed. Then this, and then up here, the moment the data came back. So you see the code is not going like this. The code is going like this, and then you see when the fetch is there.
Okay.
So promise cannot.
So I promise you I don't have to understand it.
Promise we'll cover in, I think it's next one and next after that. So for now, just understand that you use then, and then it will, once it comes back, it will go in and call.
Like here. It's just such that we get a data. I mean, we're just labeling it for our visual purposes. Okay?
This is so we can see the difference.
If this would have worked, okay, if this all would have worked, and we wouldn't have it here, and we wouldn't have this one, then we would get twice the same output here, and we couldn't see which one is which one. But it didn't work.
It didn't work. So when we use, do you remember asynchronous programming? Callback functions? That's good. So let's try that. So instead of returning it like this, because this will not work, so we will just remove this here. Then we'll make a callback function, const. We will have it called data callback. It will take, let's just do this. It will take one argument. Do you know what the argument is?
Can we just make navigation?
Oh, you want to remove this one? So we have the callback function. So instead of returning it directly with return here, which does not work, we will use the callback function. So we will give the data to whatever function we want to be called once the data comes back. We'll just say when the data comes back, call this function with the data. So I'll have the data here, data. And then we can move these statements, these console log statements in here. We will say return data, data, data. Does it make sense? So instead of following the flow, the execution flow directly and just being below it, it will call a function once the data comes back, which will handle the data that was returned. Try. So you can see before we had return data first, remaining cards undefined, and then data. Now when we call it, you will have data first, because it hits this line here first. Then it calls my callback, and then it has the data as a property, and it will output these two lines. So when you use asynchronous like fetch, when you use APIs, it's always asynchronous. It's always callback for now, at least, until you learn some other ways to handle it. So always a function, pass it in, and then do what you want to do with the data. Make sense?
Yeah.
How much time do we have? 10 minutes till lunchtime. Let's start this task. If you want to start it after? Let's start it now. There's an API. You want to show how many astronauts are in space and who they are. So there's an API here, which returns JSON. And we will fetch that and then output it on a page, similar to what this is.
And this is actually real? Like these are the...
I have no idea. It looks real, like the URL looks like an org, open notifier.
Okay. There's a German.
We have 10 minutes to lunch, so we'll have lunch and then maybe 10, 15 minutes after if you're not done. Anyway.
Yes? Everyone understood what to do? Read it and come with questions.
You should do a JavaScript file and you should use the fetch method.
So it has to be. So is fetch, that's JavaScript code, right? So it has to be in a JS file, not in a JSON file.
No more JSON.
Yeah. Now the JSON comes from the internet. And that's why we too weren't so good at typing JSON either, because we never type it. We always get a correct JSON from the internet.
Also, the callback function directly into the brackets of the flag.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
No, don't do it.
It's mean here, right?
Yeah, but that was a good example, so that they see.
Yeah, just abstraction. You would normally just put
I don't use JavaScript in the database.
Oh, okay. Normally you would group by promises is single wait now.
Yeah, so you could put the callback in here and inject. And you have to dance.
Put the data code, just remove this whole bracket here. Both then, that in, it would just, because it accepts it as a parameter.
But you can also just put in line 45 and as an argument. JSON.
Oh, just put it in here?
No.
Because responses JSON is asynchronous. Because it's produced with fetch, normally you abstract the wait, something like access or something. Abstract the wait. Write it like all fetch.
But JSON is what?
Yes. That's just what you do. The response, then you get the response as the status. Response is the
Once come back to code, whatever the problem
fetch, and then instead of this link, put the other link. And then try to console log the connection answer.
normally you call it actually data. Responses raw, yeah, responses.
Data we extract from the response.
Yes. I'll just see if I can make an
So
example.
you cannot get the data if you don't get the responses.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So it must be like this number.
Just want to show you this one here. So you can see the difference. There was a question between the difference between response and data. So when you make a request, this is what a request looks like. A response has all these. When the server replies, you get all the stuff back, which is a lot of stuff that you pretty much don't need. So this is what the response will contain, all of it. And one part of the response is the JSON format. So when you call that response.json, it means just give me the JSON and just give me that. I'm not interested in all the other stuff, right? But there's a lot of, you can do a lot of things with it if you need to.
Response.json will give me what and data will give me what.
Data is just a name I gave it. You can call it anything. You can call it result, for instance, right? But response.json will give me the, what's it called, the body of the response, that's what it's called, in a JSON format. So you will tell it, when you give it back to me, I know it's JSON, so I want it in a JSON format.
Okay. But I might not want the entire response, right? I just want some things from the response.
You will always get, when you call JSON, you will get the, the full thing. So you will get this full thing here, right? And then you can sort it out and whatever you want to do with it.
So can we say that the data is just a part of the response?
Yes.
Exactly.
The response calls it.
Filtering it, like inadvertent filtering, because it's not exactly filtering, but it's like this. We get the full response, whatever there is.
Yes.
And then we want a particular thing, which is a part of the response.
Which is the body.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the body of the response is what the data is. And everything else is like status messages or whatever. If you want to make sure if it failed, or there are other things that.
How do the body, how do you know that from okay, I have a response time. The response body should be the data. So how do I know that? How it looks like? How do I access it?
You can just console log it. Basically, when I look at that, you would use the console.
I understand. Yeah. That is going to be a body of the response, and that is going to be
Anything just that's just URL. That is done when you have a data here. That is that.
And this one start based on the sign executed. And in this kind these are the same.
One is actually easy. All of this is what.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, now I do. My question was, is this an
Oh, the astronaut again? But isn't it just because you called it with HTTPS? Isn't it just because you called it with HTTPS? Yeah. Yeah. Because you have HTTPS as the protocol, probably. You just copy the URL.
Yeah. It's the same level.
No? Oh, I have. Where's this one?
Maybe are you using Chrome?
Yeah.
Every time you want to run this code.
That's it.
I would make more because response that they have by a JavaScript3. JavaScript as a new if you would use mesh tools around questions, anyone? Does it work? Where do we need that? Yes. Otherwise, all your code now. Actually, this is a JavaScript program. Then you have another balance. Structure your code. So usually when you write a function, like a program, you start with this, because the first thing you need is like the data from the internet. Otherwise you can't do anything. So this is the first few lines of your code.
Yeah.
And then you want to do something with the data you fetch.
That's put it in the URL.
Yeah. And now we have like a program which is 1,000 lines of code. Does that make sense? And that means you had to put 1,000 lines of code in here. You don't want that, right? You want to structure your code. Okay, you want to give your code structure. So what you do is like, this one gets your data, and the data is then put in this function. So someone reads your code, sees this, okay, this just gets the data. What is done with the data? Okay, it's handled here. So it's to structure your code. And the way we structure it is by using a callback function to get our data out of this call. This. So everyone, can you put your hands up so I get your attention and nobody's touching your keyboard anymore? Can I have all your hands up? Yeah, hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up. Everyone hands up, hands up. Not all of them, hands up. Hands up, not there, hands up. It's lunchtime, right? Break.
So are you going to use the asterisk column function to explain that, or I understood it wrong? Did you get the info in the console? Yes. And now what do you want to do with the callback function?
Outside of
Access it?
outside, because now it's finished, you connect anything or anything outside of the code.
Yeah, but that is the thing. Are you going to use this info? Are you use the callback function to load this in the HTML?
Yeah.
That's what I want to do. How are you going to do it?
Yeah, I try to like console log. I'm trying to console log first.
The console log works.
No, but
It's here.
yeah, but first thing I went to the total, like to line of the
Number.
Yeah.
No.
I try to put like data.line, but there's no name.
No, that's a blend will never work. Because you're gonna have 5. How you're gonna have 6? So why don't you access number? You get the number, you get the 6. See?
Yeah.
That's what I've been thinking.
Data.number.
Oh yeah. So how you do it? Console log, data number then.
But I'm not like with the callback. So,
So, you know what I'm not doing? with the class that I met, which was low modifying the inner HTML.
Yeah.
That's what.
So I'm just doing the console log and then
Sorry.
but now I got like how to get the names.
Why it says wow. Now it's from this reference.
Printing?
Now I can print, but then
Now
I
you need
can
to
now I need to
what to
establish what I'm gonna put in. So
But then all inside of
yeah. So how will we access the number of astronauts? Can you access like the things on the other side?
the number is just data.number. Yeah, we had the yes, dollar.
Solar.
Yeah, we got the
Data.
number.
No.
And then back to
You know that I have a problem that look the amount of
yeah,
things
in
that
one
I have.
single.
I've done it that way. So then it's like okay, and then go. Ay, la puta madre.
Because sometimes it all appears after
Oh, carajo. So this is what I want to know. I love you. Okay, I'm gonna just put some milk here. You want some cookies, coffee that I can bring it with?
No, okay, quickly.
Huh?
I will just
It's the waitress in life, I think. Husband.
Want food?